and we are back again for yet another follow-on discussion regarding the lottery issue. My guest has previously explained why she isn't aware of any clear guidance that some traditional Christian views are correct. We've invited her back this week to explain why she isn't aware of any clear guidance that traditional Islamic views are correct either. Welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for having me back.
Previously, you gave us a talk regarding your concern that the belief that those who don't believe in the Holy Trinity would go to hell raises the lottery issue. What we have invited you back for is to hear why it seems to you that traditional Islamic views also raise the lottery issue.
Just to be clear, like I'm not an expert in Christianity, neither am I an expert in Islam and the Quran. But from what I've read, it does seem to me that the Quran states that those who don't believe in it will go to hell. For example, chapter 9 verse 68 can seem to state that God promises the disbelievers hell. And a few verses later in verse 71, believers can seem to be described as people who obey God and his messenger. And in chapter 7 verse 158, for example, it seems to state that people are commanded to believe in the prophet who can neither read nor write, and that is traditionally considered to be Muhammad. Therefore, it seems to me that the Quran states that believers are those that obey the command to believe in Muhammad, and that disbelievers are promised hell.
Isn't there a verse that suggests that both Jewish people and Christians will experience heaven?
There is a verse that does read a bit like that. Verse 62 of chapter 2. It can be thought to state that those Christians and Jews that believe in God and the last day, and that do right, would get to experience heaven. But I assume the key phrase is about doing right, because I am assuming it's supposed to allow the verse to be interpreted in a way in which doing right involves doing what the last messenger from God instructed people to do. With that interpretation, Christians that had heard of Muhammad and Jews that had heard of Jesus or Muhammad but hadn't followed them wouldn't be amongst those who had done right.
Okay, so you do feel that Orthodox Islamic religion, if we can call it that, does suggest that those that don't believe Muhammad was a prophet will go to hell. But you haven't answered whether you think it raises the lottery issue.
Well, if I have understood that correctly, then if there was no reasonable way of telling whether the Quran was from God, then believing it does seem to me to raise the lottery issue.
Now, in our Christianity discussion, you described some issues which would cause you some difficulty in justifying to God believing the New Testament, for example, was all true. Have you any issues regarding believing that what is written in the Quran is all true?
Yes, there are some things I would currently have a problem justifying to God believing.
For example?
Well, for me, there is the issue of the Quran account of Mary getting pregnant with Jesus while she was still a virgin. Because as I mentioned in our chat on Christianity, I had an issue with the virgin birth account given in the New Testament. I was concerned that the Hebrew text of Isaiah 7 verse 14 doesn't mention a virgin birth, and that Constantine might have had the word virgin used in Greek translations to make the verse stand alone as a prophecy which he could then associate with Jesus. Through Matthew 1 verse 22 to 23, for example. The purpose being to suggest that Jesus was known as Emmanuel, because God was literally with them in the form of Jesus. But if Constantine was responsible for the construction of the virgin birth of Jesus account, then it would seem strange the Quran mentioning Mary having a virgin birth, unless she happened to have one, coincidental to the change made by Constantine.
But in our previous conversation, you made it clear that you weren't suggesting that the alternative Constantine account you were putting forward was true.
I'm not, which is why I use the term if. But the concerns I have over Matthew 1 verses 22 to 23 concerning the virgin birth are still there. As when you read Isaiah 7, you can see that verse 14 is part of a prophesied sign to Ahaz.
Well, as you say, that was a concern you also had with what I'll call mainstream Christianity. Do you have any concerns which specifically relate to the Quran?
Yes. For example, there are accounts which, if they hadn't appeared in the Quran, I would have assumed were fictional, and yet they are in the Quran.
Can you give any examples?
Yes. Chapter 5, verse 110 of the Quran mentions Jesus shaping clay into the likeness of a bird, and turning it into a bird by blowing on it. And as I understand it, there was an account that had Jesus making clay birds into actual birds, the infancy gospel of Thomas. There are, as I understand it, several versions of it. None of the three, that I have read a translation of, mention Jesus blowing on a clay bird. But all three mention him bringing 12 clay sparrows to life.
So there is an account, the infancy gospel of Thomas before Muhammad, that does make the link between Jesus and clay birds coming to life.
Yes, but it was widely regarded as a fake by Christians, and it is easy to understand why. In all three versions, a child does something to Jesus, and Jesus then says that he won't finish his course and the child immediately dies. While the texts depict Jesus being a person of great power, they don't carry the spiritual sentiments associated with him by Christians. The child isn't following the loving, selfless path emphasized by Jesus. Instead, he seems to be performing evil acts.
But there is the saying that there is no smoke without fire. And if I'm not mistaken, the Quran doesn't claim the killing parts are true. It doesn't even closely follow that narrative. And from what you've said, the Quranic account only mentions one clay bird, not 12. And Jesus breathes the breath of life into it, which you said he doesn't do in the infancy Gospel of Thomas. Which raises the question, couldn't Jesus have brought a clay bird to life, but the infancy Gospel of Thomas have embellished his childhood with those other falsehoods?
For all I know, that could have happened. And the Quran does mention Jesus bringing a clay bird to life in more than one place. It isn't just chapter 5, verse 110. It is also mentioned in chapter 3, verse 49. And as I understand it, Islamic sources do seem to link chapter 3, verse 49 with a visit from a group of Christians. One such source being the biography of Muhammad by Ibn Ishaq. And a translation of Ibn Ishaq's work contains the following text regarding the visitors. They were Christians according to the Byzantine rite, though they differed among themselves in some points, saying he is God, and he is the Son of God, and he is the third person of the Trinity, which is the doctrine of Christianity. They argue that he is God because he used to raise the dead and heal the sick, and declare the unseen, and make clay birds and then breathe into them so that they flew away. And all this was by the command of God Almighty.
But doesn't that source just support the idea that there was an account, perhaps an oral account, believed by those Christians, in which Jesus fashioned clay into the form of a bird and brought it to life by breathing into it?
Personally, I find the idea somewhat surprising, as I would have expected the Christians to have regarded the Gospel of John as a legitimate gospel, and to have regarded verse 11 of chapter 2 of the Gospel of John as indicating that the turning of water to wine miracle was the first sign that Jesus performed. And if that was so, then it would seem to follow that they would consider reports of Jesus performing signs before that as false reports.
Well, which way do you want it? On the one hand, you seem to be considering how the accounts of the visit by those Christians could explain the account of Jesus breathing into a clay bird appearing in the Quran, and on the other hand, disbelieving the account because you don't think Christians would have believed such a thing.
I was considering the option that they did ask Muhammad to show them a servant that could revive the dead, heal the sick, and fashion a bird out of clay and bring it to life by breathing life into it. But that it was a test. That possibly they had heard from those that didn't believe in Muhammad, that he incorporated apocryphal stories from other accounts into his own, and wanted to see whether that story would be incorporated. That they never claimed they believed Jesus had ever fashioned a bird out of clay and breathed life into it. That the reason they were saying it was because they were testing Muhammad. Would he tell them that Jesus never fashioned a bird out of clay and breathed life into it?
If they were doing that, then why not just use the story found in the infancy Gospel of Thomas?
Perhaps because the infancy Gospel of Thomas type books were already considered apocryphal by the Church by the time of Muhammad. The Decretum Galatianum is a work containing a list of books that the Church considered apocryphal, one of which was listed as the Book on the Infancy of the Savior, an account which may have contained the story of the clay sparrows. Therefore, I can imagine it would make sense for the Christian delegation to choose not to use the exact version of the story found in a book whose authenticity the Church had openly declared it doubted, because Muhammad might have been aware of the Church's declaration. The delegation changing it would allow them to distinguish the claim that they were talking about from the one found in the apocryphal book, leaving open to the imagination the possibility that writers of apocryphal books had embellished an otherwise existing oral tradition amongst Christians. And in Genesis 2 verse 7, God brings the form of man, made from dust from the ground to life by breathing the breath of life into it. This could be used to support the idea that if Jesus could do the same to birds, then Jesus was God. As what prophet ever had the ability to breathe the breath of life into things? They might even have been aware of verses 28 to 29 of chapter 15 of the Quran, which, like Genesis 2 verse 7, seem to indicate God bringing man to life by breathing his spirit into it, and thus would have had an extra reason to believe that, Muhammad would attach a certain significance to them mentioning Jesus bringing a bird to life by breathing the breath of life into it. If they weren't aware of those Quranic verses, then they might have simply intended to connect the story to Genesis 2 verse 7, to allow them to make out it was part of an argument for Jesus being God. And if a group of Christians did visit Muhammad, then I wouldn't have found it surprising if they had been skeptical about Muhammad being a prophet, and had thought of a way of testing him before they arrived. I'm not saying that is what happened, but it is something that I've considered, something which would explain them coming across as seemingly believing in Jesus performing a miracle earlier than the water-to-wine miracle, when John chapter 2 verse 11 seems to indicate that the water-to-wine miracle was the first miraculous sign Jesus performed.
I can see why the account raises questions for you. But presumably you aren't writing off the possibility that the account of Jesus bringing a clay bird to life did have an oral history to it. And while such an idea might contradict the John account, you yourself in our talk on Christianity raised the possibility that parts of the John account might be suspect.
You're right. I'm not writing off the possibility that some of them did believe that Jesus brought a bird to life. I'm just pointing out that it isn't the type of thing that I would have expected the average Christian to have believed, because of John 2 verse 11. And the possibility that the Christian delegation were simply testing Muhammad doesn't seem that outlandish. And from the translation of Ibn Ishaq's writing, it seems clear that the Christian delegation left believing that Muhammad wasn't a prophet, because they didn't convert. But like with the Christianity, I'd like to be clear. I'm not suggesting that the Quran isn't correct about Jesus bringing a clay bird to life. I'm just pointing out that it is a claim which, if it wasn't in the Quran, I would have assumed it was false. And when it comes to justifying to God believing it, God knows I can imagine an alternative explanation. But that doesn't mean Jesus bringing a clay bird to life isn't true. I'm just explaining why currently I would have trouble justifying to God believing it.
So can you give another example of an account which appeared outside of the Quran, which if it hadn't also appeared in the Quran, you would have assumed was fictional?
Yes. Chapter 18 of the Quran is known as the Cave, and from the Pickthall translation of verses 9 to 26 it seems to me that the verses concern a group of young men and their dog that took refuge in a cave and were put to sleep for a period of time. The account doesn't state how many men it was, but it states that some people will say it was 3, 4 including the dog, while others will say that it is 5, 6 including the dog, and yet others 7, 8 including the dog. And verse 25 seems to indicate that the men remained in the cave for roughly 309 years. The Pickthall translation has in brackets the phrase, "it is said," but that is an addition that Pickthall is making for clarity for the reader. Other translations I have read don't do that.
Okay, so carry on.
Well, the account sounds like the legend that is sometimes known as the legend of the 7 sleepers, though the amount of sleepers can vary depending on the version of the legend. As I understand it, by the 7th century there were several versions. In the version retold by the 13th century Archbishop of Genoa, Jacobus de Voragine, the group consisted of 7 Christian men from the city of Ephesus. According to that account, the Roman Emperor Decius came to Ephesus to persecute Christians, and commanded that anyone that didn't sacrifice to the temple idols should be put to death. The Christians were frightened, and almost all sacrificed to the idols, but not these 7 men. They hid in their homes, fasting and praying, but were accused and brought before Decius, who gave them until his next visit to repent and worship the idols. Instead, they sold their estates, gave the money to the poor, and went off to hide in Mount Kilian. When Decius returned, he demanded they be fetched. And one of the group who had gone to the city to get food and drink heard about the summons and returned and told the others about it. And although they were all frightened, all 7 of them then fell asleep. With them failing to appear to his summons, Decius summoned the families of the 7 and threatened them to gain the whereabouts of the 7. And on finding out the cave that they were in, Decius had the entrance sealed up. Then the ministers and 2 men wrote about their martyrdom and laid it among the stones. Years later, an inhabitant of Ephesus put it in his will that he would make that mountain a stable for his pasturers and herdsmen. And it was the masons that were building the stable that opened up the cave. On the cave opening, the 7 awoke, but thought it was the next day. And the one that had warned them again went out to get some food, but when he arrived at Ephesus, he saw signs of the crucifix over both the city gates. He then heard the bread merchants talking about Jesus, and he was astonished and wondered if he was in a different city, but they assured him it was Ephesus. When he came to pay for the bread, the sellers were astonished at the old coins and thought he must have found some hidden treasure, and when he saw them speaking together, he thought they were going to hand him into the emperor. He told them they could keep the bread and the money, but they held him and demanded to know where the treasure was. Anyway, eventually, he is brought before the representatives of the church and is questioned. It is mentioned in the story that it was a time of a heresy which denied the resurrection of dead bodies, and that the Emperor Theodosius had been praying for a sign regarding the resurrection. It was then during the questioning that the bishop thought to himself that this was a sign from God. The man was followed back to his friends, and the letters in the stones were found. The bishop and judge then sent word to Theodosius to come and see the marvel for himself. The letters hidden amongst the rocks would explain why in verse 9 the Quran mentions an inscription along with the cave. And the story of the 7 sleepers provides an explanation of why the Quran seems to report in verses 14 to 15, the sleepers stating that their people had chosen to worship other gods beside the Most High. As chapter 5 verses 72 to 73 of the Quran seems to suggest that Christians ascribe partners to God. Presumably, the idea is that what the Christians call the Father is God, and that they ascribe the Son and the Holy Spirit as partners. Therefore, if the sleepers had come from a Christian population, it would explain why the sleepers stated their people had chosen to worship other gods besides the Father. Though Decius demanding the Christians to worship other gods, in the 7 sleeper story, and many of their fellow Christians having at least gone through the motions of doing that, would also explain it. Though the Christianity explanation seems to me to explain verse 16 of chapter 18 better. Because in it, the sleepers seem to be told to withdraw from their people, and that which they worship other than God, which seems to me to suggest that they too had once worshipped that which their people had worshipped, in order that they should withdraw from such worship.
And do they sleep for roughly 300 years in that version?
Well, there seems to be some confusion over how long the Archbishop of Genoa, Jacobus de Voragine, suggested they slept, because different translations of his report of it give a different time. For now, I'll go with the 15th century translation of his work by William Caxton, as it is closer in time to when the Archbishop wrote the account. The Caxton translation uses both the phrase 362 years after and mentions it being the 30th year of Theodosius the Emperor. And later, when mentioning the coins that one of the 7 tried to use to buy bread upon awaking, it mentions that the text on the coins indicated them to be 372 years old. But there is an issue, which in the alternative account arises from a misunderstanding. As I understand it, according to modern estimates, the Emperor Decius was emperor from 249 to 251 CE. And regarding Theodosius, there were 2 emperors with that name, Theodosius I and Theodosius II. The first reigning from 379 to 395 CE, and the second from 401 to 450 CE. Since the account mentions the 30th year of Theodosius's reign, it is easy to conclude that the Theodosius being referred to is Theodosius II, as Theodosius I didn't reign for even 20 years. But there is a problem. Even Theodosius II didn't reign 362 years after Decius. It would be about 200 years. And the Archbishop Jacobus de Voragine notes the problem in his reporting of the account. The Caxton translation has the Archbishop suggesting that Decius reigned in 270 and that the sleepers awoke in the year 478 CE. Although those dates for Decius and Theodosius II fall outside current reported accepted ranges, in the Caxton translation, the Archbishop uses them to calculate that the sleepers slept for 208 years.
Earlier on, you mentioned that you thought the amount of time slept might have reflected a potential misunderstanding.
Yes, well, it occurred to me that when the story stated after 362 years, it wasn't meant as people such as Jacobus de Voragine were suggesting, 362 years after they fell asleep in the cave. Instead, I was imagining that the time of 300 and something years after originally was a casual expression of time, relating to the crucifixion of Jesus and the sign of Jonah, similar to how later time was related to the birth of Jesus when BC and AD were introduced. If Jesus had been sent for crucifixion in 34 CE, then adding 362 years to it would make it the year after the reign of Theodosius I. In the alternative account, the issue some followers had wasn't with the resurrection of the dead in general. It was with the resurrection of Jesus, and that this had been an issue through the reign of Constantine and Theodosius I. Then later there were those that wished for it to be covered up, that those early followers didn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, and not only tried to make it seem that it was a more general issue about resurrection, but also that it happened during the reign of Theodosius II rather than that of Theodosius I. To make out it was a heresy that emerged later, rather than being an opinion common amongst the early followers. And they might have done that by adding some embellishments to the story of the seven sleepers to make it seem like it was an incident that happened during the reign of Theodosius II rather than that of Theodosius I. The embellishments could include changing the year to 362 years from whatever it was, say the year 359, for example. In order to make it outside of Theodosius I's reign, were you to add 34 years onto it? And then, to further disguise what had been done, embellishments could be added. The coins could be said to have been an age similar to that the sleepers were said to have slept, to disguise that originally they weren't thought to have slept for that long. And the embellishment that they awoke in the 30th year of Theodosius could have been added to make it appear as though the sleepers awoke during the reign of Theodosius II rather than Theodosius I. And such motivation could explain at least one of the differences I found between William Caxton's 15th century translation and William Granger Ryan's 20th century translation. Regarding when the sleepers awoke, the Caxton translation has it 362 years after, but the Ryan translation has it 372 years later, and the difference is consistent across two mentions in the text. An explanation could be that adding an extra 10 years on would make it further outside of the reign of Theodosius I, were one to consider the idea that the years reflected a point in time rather than how long the sleepers had slept for. Some of the other differences have to do with the archbishop's estimates of when Theodosius II and Decius reigned, and could be thought to improve those estimates. For example, the Claxton translation has them being awoken in 478 CE, which seems way outside of modern estimates of when Theodosius II reigned. The Ryan translation seems to correct this by having them awakening in 448 CE, which, while it wouldn't be the 30th year of Theodosius II's reign according to modern estimates, it is at least a year within his reign. The Claxton translation has Decius reigning in 270 CE, and the Ryan translation has him reigning in 252, which is much closer to modern estimates. The Claxton translation has the archbishop estimating they slept for 208 years, and the Ryan translation has the archbishop estimating they slept for 195 years. It doesn't seem plausible to me that these are accidental changes, because in both translations the numbers add up, with the Caxton translation using the start year of Decius's reign, and the Ryan translation using the date from a year into Decius's reign. Now, while these other changes can simply be explained as corrections to the archbishop's estimates of when those emperors reigned, they do seem to be intentional. Anyway, the idea that there were a significant amount of followers of Jesus during the reign of Theodosius I that didn't believe that Jesus had died and resurrected is compatible with the alternative account I was putting forward in our Christianity discussion. And while all the modern versions of the Roman Catholic Nicene Creed that I've read specifically state that Jesus had died before he rose, it wasn't specifically stated in either the Nicene Creed under Constantine or the one under Theodosius I. The Constantine Nicene Creed states that Jesus suffered and rose again on the third day, and that statement could be agreed upon by followers that believed Jesus had survived the execution and was laid out in a tomb before rising up and leaving the tomb 3 days later. And expanding upon the alternative account that I outlined in our Christianity discussion, I can imagine that those that held the view that Jesus hadn't died ended up feeling uneasy about using the expression rose again, because they knew it was being interpreted by many as meaning resurrected, and that since they didn't personally believe Jesus resurrected, they grew uncomfortable saying it, leading to a problem for Theodosius I concerning keeping the vast majority of Christians unified under one church, one creed. A solution could have been to add the phrase according to the scriptures to the creed, because then the followers that didn't think Jesus had resurrected could nevertheless accept that according to the church scriptures he did die and rise again. Thus they could say the line while remaining true to God in their hearts, in the knowledge that even those that did believe in the resurrection would know the phrase had been added to the creed, because not all members of the church did believe it. And by making it explicit, those that believed in the resurrection, and those that didn't, could be unified under one creed under one church, and Theodosius I would have solved the problem. And that situation would explain why a happening such as the Seven Sleepers would have been so useful for Theodosius I, because it could be used to try to convince those in his church that didn't believe in the resurrection to believe in it. Incidentally, in the modern creed, in English anyway, the wording is no longer according to the scriptures, but is instead in fulfillment of the scriptures. It removes the interpretation that I was imagining Theodosius I might have solved the problem with, but in doing so raises the question of what scriptures, prior to Jesus, prophesied a person resurrecting on the third day, such that by doing so Jesus could be said to have fulfilled those scriptures. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked back to Christianity issues. I was just trying to explain why I was imagining people might have intentionally changed the account to date the incident to Theodosius II rather than Theodosius I. To cover up that there were early followers of Jesus that didn't believe Jesus had died and resurrected, and that the belief was still widespread during the reign of Theodosius I.
Whether the archbishop reported they had slept for 362 years, or 372 years, or 359 years for that matter, it would still be much longer than the 300 or so years specified in the Quran. And whether the archbishop's personal estimate had have been 208 years or 195 years, it would be much shorter than 300 years. Isn't that a clear indication that the Quranic version was not based on accounts like these?
I don't know whether I would go that far. I'm not suggesting that the Quran wasn't revealed by God, but in order for me to justify to God believing it is, I feel I'd have to check for whether there was any clear guidance that it was. Because I feel that I would have to assess whether I could justify to God believing that it didn't raise the lottery issue. And checking whether there was any clear guidance for the understanding seems to me to involve considering that there wasn't. Whether there are any plausible alternative explanations, for example. And with the roughly 300-year sleep, I can imagine another explanation. I can imagine that if a person had been told that many people thought the sleepers slept for 359 years, for example, and also that the many people had mistakenly thought that the sleepers had awoken under Theodosius II when they had actually awoken under Theodosius I. Then if that person was constructing an account, they might have made the mistake of reducing the amount of years the people were said to have slept, by say, 50 years, for example, with the idea that it would imply that in their account, the people awoke 50 years earlier than people had commonly thought, and that it would make it in the reign of Theodosius I rather than Theodosius II. The motive being that if it then later came to light to the less knowledgeable that the event happened during the time of Theodosius I rather than Theodosius II, then it would support their account. I'm not saying that is what happened, I'm just saying that the 300 or 309 years by itself doesn't seem to me to be a clear indication that it couldn't be based on a Seven Sleepers type account. I wouldn't know how to justify to God claiming that the amount of years being incorrect for a story in which the people go to sleep during the reign of Decius and awaken during the reign of either Theodosius I or II is a clear sign that it wasn't based on such a story.
Okay, but we have been talking about this sleepers issue for some time now, and while I can understand that you can imagine an alternative, I'm not clear on what issue you have with justifying to God believing what is written rather than your alternative.
Well, one issue is that it seems to me it is widely thought that the Quran account is referring to the event that the seven sleeper stories are supposedly about. And there seem to be so many similarities between the stories. Chapter 18, verse 19, for example, has one of them going into town, by himself, to buy food for them all, using coinage from the time they went to sleep. But in those stories, if the sleepers went to sleep in the reign of Decius, as the Christian accounts report, then if modern estimates were even close, they wouldn't have been sleeping for much over 200 years. Yet the Quran seems to state about 300 years. One defense I can imagine is that offered by the Pickthall translation. Pickthall adds in the words, "it is said," indicating that in his interpretation, the Quran isn't stating it was around 300 years, It was other people that were saying such things.
Doesn't that resolve your problems then? The similarities between the Quran account and the Seven Sleepers account can be due to it being the same incident that is described. And the issue that there wasn't 300 years between the reign of Decius and Theodosius II isn't at odds with the Quran, because the Quran wasn't stating that there had been. It was stating that people were saying there had been.
But there are still other issues. For example, as I understand it, stories about people sleeping for long periods of time weren't unknown before. As I understand it, the Greek writer Diogenes Laertius is supposed to have written about the story of Epimenides. Give me a moment and I'll just read a translated extract from the account. One day he was sent into the country by his father to look for a stray sheep, and at noon he turned aside of the way and went to sleep in a cave where he slept for 57 years. After this he got up and went in search of the sheep, thinking he had been asleep only for a short time. And when he could not find it, he came to the farm and found everything changed and another owner in possession. Then he went back to the town in utter perplexity, and there, on entering his own house, he fell in with people who wanted to know who he was. At length he found his younger brother, now an old man, and learnt the truth from him. So he became famous throughout Greece and was believed to be a special favorite of heaven. Which then brings me to the question of whether I should believe Epimenides slept for 57 years. In the Epimenides account, the people assume him to be a special favorite of heaven to have slept for so long. And later on in the account, he is called upon to help stop a plague, and his solution is said to have involved sacrifices to the local gods. Therefore, why would God have performed the miracle of letting him sleep for so long? If there was some medical condition which allowed people to sleep for such a long time, then with the world population as it is, I would have expected there to be an example of someone having it, but as far as I am aware, no one does. Plus, there would be issues such as muscular dystrophy, where the muscles would waste away while the person was sleeping, such that when they awoke, they would be unable to walk. Which leads me to think that the story of Epimenides is just a fictional account, something that is supposed to have happened around 600 BCE, which hasn't taken into account medical conditions such as muscular dystrophy. But if the account of Epimenides is a fiction, it is a fiction which bears certain similarities to the story of the Seven Sleepers. Like the sleepers, Epimenides sleeps in a cave, wakes up after a long period of time, but doesn't realize how long he has slept, and when he goes out of the cave, he finds the world has changed, is confused. But eventually what happened is established. In his case, by meeting an aged relative, in the case of the sleepers, who had slept longer and would have no relatives, by an incident with old coins, resulting in them meeting a judge and bishop, who find writings at the cave that corroborate their story. Which God knows makes me wonder whether Theodosius I had arranged for some young men, equipped with old coins, to pretend that they had awoken after being sealed in a cave for a long period of time, for the purpose of convincing those that didn't believe that Jesus died and resurrected that in fact he did. I can imagine that by the time Theodosius arrived at the place to apparently see for himself, the news about the incident had already spread, as had the news that the event was so monumental that the Roman emperor himself was coming to see it, because I can imagine that agents of Theodosius would have helped ensure that news had spread. Then when Theodosius arrived, I assume he had the sleepers killed, presumably by poisoning, so they would never be able to let slip that they had been given the coins and been instructed to pretend they had slept.
You're imagining he had them killed?
Yes, in this alternative, I am imagining they would have played their part, and leaving them alive would have been a risk. One might have got drunk someday, and said something. In the account given by the archbishop, Emperor Theodosius is summoned, and he visits the sleepers who are awake back in the cave. When they see him, their faces shine, and one of them tells the emperor that they had been raised for the purpose that he should believe in the resurrection of dead people. And after that had been said, they all inclined their heads and died. It is easy for me to imagine that Theodosius was an educated Epicurean and had based the plot on the story of Epimenides, which is found in a work about eminent philosophers, which devotes a whole book to Epicurus. Other educated Roman Epicureans might know the story of Epimenides, but that wouldn't matter. The function of the sleeper's ruse would have been to manipulate the less well-educated Christian masses into believing that Jesus had resurrected, and that the miracle of the sleeper's awakening had been in answer to the emperor's prayers, which entails the idea of God responding to Theodosius's prayers with a miracle, which in turn suggests that Theodosius was a pious man, Obviously, I'm not saying that is what happened. I'm just saying that it doesn't seem such a stretch of the imagination to imagine that it did happen in that type of way. And the story of Epimenides did make me wonder about it. Though that isn't to suggest that Theodosius wouldn't have been capable of constructing such a scheme, even without the story of Epimenides. The point is that the story of Epimenides does seem to discredit the account of the seven sleepers. But even if I imagine that the work of Diogenes Laertius containing the story of Epimenides was constructed by Christians after the time of Muhammad, with the purpose of trying to discredit the story of the seven sleepers, and with it the Quran, and if I were to also imagine that the account of a dog being with the seven sleepers had also been removed from all the Christian accounts but one, to make it look like it was simply an embellishment made in a single account, again with the motive of discrediting the Quranic account, which seems to suggest at least 3 accounts reporting a dog. Even if I do that, even if I imagine Christians had accounts constructed or modified to discredit the Quran, I am still left with issues with the Islamic reports on the matter.
What issues are you talking about?
The Tafsir by Ibn Kathir is, as I understand it, regarded by many Sunnis as the best after Tafsir al-Tabari, and in his Tafsir he gives a report of the context behind the chapter. He recounts a report given by Muhammad bin Ishaq, in which Muhammad's tribe sent some men to the Jewish tribes of Medina to give an account of Muhammad to them and to see what they thought of him. In response, they were told to ask Muhammad 3 things, and that if he answers, he is a prophet, but if he doesn't, then he isn't. The first was what was the strange and wondrous tale of some young men in ancient times. The second was about a man who traveled a great deal and reached the east and west of the earth. And the third was about the soul. The report has the men of his tribe returning and asking Muhammad about the 3 things, and Muhammad replying that the next day he would tell them about what they had asked. But according to the account, Muhammad didn't have an answer the next day, or the day after that, or the day after that. It is easy to imagine that it became a slightly tense time for the followers. Anyway, it is reported that 15 days had passed before the angel Jibril came to Muhammad about the companions of the cave. The Tafsir mentions that Muhammad did not say if God wills after saying he would tell them the next day, which explains verses 23 to 24 of chapter 18 of the Quran. Now I mentioned that in the Tafsir by Ibn Kathir he mentions the report given by Muhammad bin Ishaq. Well, I've read a translation of an abridged version of what Muhammad bin Ishaq wrote, which was edited by Ibn Hisham in the 9th century. But what I've read doesn't seem to be quite the same as it is reported in the Tafsir by Ibn Kathir. For example, it didn't just have the first topic asked about as what the strange and wondrous tale of some young men in ancient time was. Instead, it has Muhammad being asked about the marvelous story of the young men that disappeared in ancient times. And also it has the rabbis saying that Muhammad has to give the right answer to be considered a prophet, not simply answer.
So there are some slight differences. Why should that matter?
Well, the first difference isn't too important, I guess, but the second difference could be thought to be, because it raises the question of whether Muhammad answered the question correctly. And what I find hard to imagine is the rabbis describing the story of the 7 sleepers as a wondrous story. Because while many Christians may have believed it, I would have thought the rabbis would have considered it a blasphemous fraud. And if you remember, I mentioned previously how chapter 18 verse 16 of the Quran did seem to fit with the idea of the sleepers being Christians. And if they were, as is thought in the Christian tradition, then as I said, I would have imagined rabbis to have thought it was a blasphemous fraud rather than a wondrous tale.
But if not the tale of the 7 sleepers, then what tale could they have been asking about?
I don't know. But there are other tales which could be thought to fit that description, like the tale of David and the young men with him hiding from Saul, for example. They managed to disappear from the sight of Saul and his men, and I could imagine the rabbis to consider it to be in ancient times, and to also be a wondrous story in which Saul is delivered into David's hands on more than one occasion, and David spares his life each time, despite Saul being out to kill him. I'm not suggesting that was the answer, I'm just giving it as an example. Whereas I'm not sure they would have considered Decius, who lived after the destruction of the temple by the Romans, to have been in ancient times, because he wouldn't have lived during the times recorded in the Hebrew Bible, or even the Christian Bible for that matter.
You are presumably not discarding the possibility that the rabbis had chosen the account of the sleepers, precisely because no one would have expected rabbis to have chosen an account from Christian legend?
You're right, I'm not disregarding it. But if that had been the case, then I would imagine they would have been quite surprised when Muhammad responded about the Christian legend they had been thinking of. However, as I understand it, when Muhammad gave the answers he did, neither his own tribe nor the Jewish rabbis thought he was a prophet.
But if Muhammad provided the wrong answers, wouldn't that have been a well-documented fact in the Jewish tradition?
Not necessarily. Not if Muhammad had pretty much wiped that Jewish community out, for example.
Wipe the community out?
I'm not saying he did. I was just giving an example of the type of event that if he had provided answers they thought were incorrect, would stop them talking about it. Another explanation would be that even if the rabbis regarded the answers as incorrect, they weren't that bothered. A false prophet wouldn't be that big news.
Is there any report that even hints that he might have wiped them out?
Well, in his account of the life of Muhammad bin Ishaq does report that Muhammad migrated to Yathrib, which later became known as Medina. As I understand it, this is widely accepted. Muhammad bin Ishaq also reports that the rabbis who posed those questions to him were from Medina, and he reports that Muhammad and his men put a Jewish tribe situated around Medina under siege, and when they surrendered, all the men above puberty were beheaded, and their wives and children and property were distributed amongst his followers.
Because of the questions?
Not in the report by Muhammad bin Ishaq, no. But it isn't difficult to imagine that Muhammad had moved to Medina with the intention that the rabbis were to be dealt with. And just to be clear again, I'm not suggesting that he did go there with such an intention. I am just pointing out an alternative that God knows I can imagine. And the reason I am doing that is to highlight the type of problems people might have in believing Muhammad was a prophet of God.
Yes, we understand that. Could you please just explain the reasons Muhammad bin Ishaq's report gives as to why they were executed? And perhaps indicate how those reports could tie in with the alternative you are imagining.
Well, I don't want to go into too much detail, as we are after all getting quite away from the sleeper's account itself. But my understanding of the report is that it indicates Muhammad migrated with his followers to Medina. And when he got there, he built a mosque, and then wrote up a covenant between his group and the people from Medina and the Jewish tribes that were situated on its outskirts. Concerning war, the covenant stipulated all parties are to go to war if any of the parties are attacked, or if Medina or Yathrib, as it was then known, was attacked. And when at war, each party would bear its own costs. Furthermore, no party could start a war without Muhammad's permission, and if any of the parties were called upon to make peace and maintain it, they must do so, unless the party was Muhammad and his followers, and the war was a holy war. And the report also indicates that the vast majority of the Jewish rabbis were against Muhammad.
The vast majority?
Well, Muhammad bin Ishaq lists over 40 that were what he describes as rancorous opponents of the apostle and his companions, and gives 2 exceptions. His report suggests that the Jewish rabbis showed hostility to the apostle in envy, hatred, and malice because God had chosen his apostle from the Arabs. But I find that explanation of their hostility to Muhammad hard to believe, as it would imply that the rabbis collectively decided to go against God, which for me anyway, makes Muhammad bin Ishaq's explanation seem implausible. It is one thing for someone that believes in God to go against a person that they believe to be a false prophet, but it is a totally different thing for them to go against a person that they believe is a prophet. With the alternative account, I can imagine that their opposition to him was because they didn't consider him a prophet, perhaps partly because of the answers he had given to the questions they had set. Imagining that to be the case, it is easy to further imagine that they would have felt threatened when, after giving those answers, he turned up with what could function as an army, and then asked them to sign an agreement which he had written up, and which I imagine they considered unfair.
Why would they consider the agreement unfair?
Well, if they did think he was a false prophet, then they would hardly think he was a trustworthy person. And the way the agreement was written, he could just declare a war with anyone and call it a holy war. And if the targets of his holy war attacked back, then the Jewish communities would have to risk their men's lives and pay the expenses because of wars that he started. Not that they would have started wars, but there wasn't the option for them to do the same, as whereas they needed to get his agreement, he didn't need to get theirs.
But Muhammad was offering them protection.
Yes, but in the imagined alternative account, who they thought they needed protection against was Muhammad, that they were doing fine before he turned up. And in such circumstances, I can imagine they would have thought the agreement unfair, and just being used as a pretext to attack them if they refused to sign. And so they signed, at the point of an imagined sword, so to speak. And according to Ibn Ishaq's report, after they and the tribes of Medina had signed, Muhammad declared a holy war against his tribe from Mecca, and instigated raids, and looked to ambush their trading caravans and take their money and merchandise. His group, and those that went along with them, would get the plunder from the raids, and if the people that were attacked tried to retaliate, the nearby Jewish tribes would be obliged to help Muhammad and his men, while paying their own expenses themselves, while the raiders had the plunder to help cover their costs. In this imagined alternative account, where the Jewish tribes didn't believe Muhammad was a prophet, it is easy to imagine that they just considered Muhammad's declaration of a holy war as a blasphemous cover for banditry. Anyway, an attempted raid on a trading caravan returning from Syria to Mecca did end up in a battle, the Battle of Badr. The Meccan tribesmen sent out forces initially to defend the caravan, but the caravan managed to escape Muhammad's ambush and get back safely by itself. Since the caravan was safe, some of the Meccan tribesmen then turned back, but those that didn't ended up in conflict with Muhammad and his followers. A battle known as the Battle of Badr, which Muhammad's side won. According to Muhammad bin Ishaq, it was after this battle that Muhammad came to one of the Jewish tribes of the area, the Banu Kainuka, and demanded that they adopt his religion. They refused, and he besieged them. Muhammad bin Ishaq's account does state that one of his sources said that Banu Kainuka were the first of the Jewish tribes to break their agreement with the apostle and go to war, though that explanation seems to me doubtful. If they were intimidated enough to sign an unbalanced agreement with a person they regarded as a false prophet, why would they give an excuse for that person to attack them by breaking the agreement? Also, there is no information about who they were supposed to have gone to war with. But as I mentioned, the translation of Muhammad bin Ishaq's work that I was using was based upon the abridgment made by Ibn Hisham in the 9th century. And in Ibn Hisham's notes, there is what seems to me to be an alternative explanation of what provoked Muhammad to demand the tribe to convert, lest he attack them. In his notes, Ibn Hisham gives a report of an Arab woman bringing goods to sell in the Banu Kainuka market and sitting by a goldsmith's. It is claimed that the people tried to get her to uncover her face, but she refused. And then it is claimed that the goldsmith fastened the end of her skirt to her back, so that when she got up, she was immodestly exposed. And when the people laughed at her, she then let out a large cry, which resulted in one of Muhammad's followers leaping in and killing the goldsmith, the follower then being killed himself by the Jewish people around. The report then states that the follower's family then called upon Muhammad's followers for help against the Jews. This seems to be given as the reason Muhammad demanded that the tribe accept him as a prophet and convert. Anyway, the report states that once they surrendered, a leader of one of the Arab tribes from Medina stepped in and demanded the Muhammad deal kindly with them and not kill them, because the Jewish tribe had been allies of theirs and had protected that leader from all his enemies, and that Muhammad gave them over to that leader. And as I understand it, the tribe was expelled from Medina, and presumably either that leader or Muhammad took their property to do with as he saw fit.
You mentioned Muhammad expelling the tribe. Does the translation you were reading from actually state that?
No, it doesn't, but as I understand it, that is what is commonly thought. And there are hadith that report that Muhammad ended up exiling all the Jews from Medina. For example, Sahih al-Bukhari, number 4028. Anyway, the next battle was known as the Battle of Uhud, which involved the tribes of Mecca sending men out towards Medina. They were met by Muhammad and his followers, but this time overcame them. After this battle, Muhammad bin Ishaq's report states that Muhammad came to the Jewish tribe Banu al-Nadir and asked them to contribute to a blood wit. The payment was to make up for where one of Muhammad's companions had killed 2 men from a tribe Banu al-Nadir had an alliance with. The killing had taken place after the companion had given them a promise of security. It seems to me that this request might have been quite testing for them, but if they did believe Muhammad was a false prophet and more like a bandit, then while being asked to contribute towards a blood wit payment due for what one of Muhammad's men had done, might have seemed unjust, because why should it be their expense? They might have nevertheless thought that if they refused, Muhammad might use it as a pretext for laying siege to them before exiling them as he had done with Banu Kainuka. Anyway, the report has Banu al-Nadir replying that of course they would contribute to the blood wit in the way that Muhammad wanted. But it also reports that while Muhammad was at the settlement, word came from heaven to him that the tribesmen of Al-Nadir were planning to drop a rock on him as he sat by one of their houses with his companions. So Muhammad left his companions and went back to Medina. When he didn't come back, his companions went looking for him, and when they found him, Muhammad told them of the treachery that the Jewish tribe was planning against him and ordered them to prepare for war and to march against them. Banu al-Nadir hid in their forts, and while they did so, Muhammad ordered that their palm trees be cut down and burnt. The tribe then asked to be deported, but their lives spared, and be allowed to take all they could carry on camels except armor. Muhammad agreed, and subsequently divided up what had been their property among some of his followers.
But what about the execution?
Muhammad bin Ishaq reports a third battle, known as the Battle of the Ditch. Whereas after the Battle of Uhud had taken place a distance from Medina, and afterwards the Meccans had returned to Mecca, at the Battle of the Ditch, the Meccans brought their forces to Medina. Muhammad bin Ishaq's report states that it was a group of Jews that encouraged the Quraysh tribe from Mecca to attack Muhammad in Medina by saying that the Meccan religion was better than Muhammad's, which seems to me pretty doubtful, as it seems to imply the Meccans were more bothered about what Jewish people thought about their religion than they were about Muhammad and his followers raiding their caravans. But anyway, his report states that Muhammad learnt of the Meccans' intention to attack and drew a trench around Medina. He also reports that one of the Jewish al-Nadri tribe, which was the tribe Muhammad had asked to contribute to the Bloodwit, managed to convince the leader of the remaining Jewish al-Qurayza tribe to break his allegiance with Muhammad. But Muhammad heard about the betrayal and sent some people to find out whether it was true. And once he found out that it was, he sent a man to sow distrust between the al-Qurayza tribe and the Quraysh and the Ghatafan tribe that had joined them, telling al-Qurayza to ask for some hostages to be handed over to them to ensure the Meccans and their allies didn't give up the fight and leave them to their fate with Muhammad and his followers, and telling both the Quraysh and the Ghatafan that al-Qurayza had regretted their actions of opposing Muhammad and were hoping to get some chiefs to hand over to Muhammad so he could cut their heads off. With the distrust sown, and being unable to mount a serious attack across the trench, the Quraysh and Ghatafan gave up their attack and returned home. The report goes on to say how, after the Meccan forces had left, Muhammad and his followers laid their arms aside, but then the angel Gabriel appeared and told Muhammad that God commanded him to go to Banu al-Qurayza. Muhammad did so and besieged them for 25 nights. According to the report, Banu al-Qurayza sent word to Muhammad to send them a man called Abu Lubaba so that they could consult with him. That Abu Lubaba was sent, and the al-Qurayza asked him whether he thought that they should submit to Muhammad's judgment, that while he said yes, he pointed his hand to his throat, signifying slaughter. Anyway, the report has it that in the morning Banu al-Qurayza did submit to Muhammad's judgment, and when they did, Al-Aus, a tribe that was allied with them, jumped up and said, "O Apostle, they are our allies, not allies of Khazraj, and we know how you recently treated the allies of our brethren." They were referring to the incident with Banu Kainuka, where Abdullah bin Ubay of the Khazraj tribe had stepped in to insist Muhammad treat them kindly and not kill them. And in that case, Muhammad didn't have them killed, but instead gave them over to Abdullah. It seems clear that Al-Aus were hoping for a similar outcome to this event, but Muhammad replied, "Will you be satisfied, O Aus, if one of your own number pronounces judgment on them?" And when they said they would, Muhammad informed them that Sa'd bin Mu'adh would be the arbitrator. As he was being brought, his tribe asked him to deal kindly with them, but he replied that the time had come for him in the cause of God, and that he was not to care for any man's censure. It seems to me significant with regards of Muhammad's choice of Sa'd bin Mu'adh that earlier in the text it had been indicated that by this time Sa'd bin Mu'adh reviled Banu al-Qurayza, and they reviled him, and he had already taken to insulting them. It doesn't seem like he listened to Banu al-Qurayza's side of the matter, and instead just passed sentence, the sentence being that all the men of Banu al-Qurayza above puberty were to be beheaded, and their wives and children and property were distributed amongst his followers. If the Jewish rabbis that had been those that had given the Quraysh the questions to test Muhammad with were from Banu al-Qurayza, then even if Muhammad had answered the questions wrong, it wouldn't be too surprising if the account didn't spread too far amongst the Middle Eastern Jewish communities. Firstly, presumably all the male eyewitnesses above puberty would have been executed, with the women and children possibly enslaved or married. And secondly, with the subsequent spread of Islam, making such claims would be dangerous.
but Muhammad didn't make Banu al-Qurayza betray him. And yes, they were killed, and that does sound harsh. But isn't it in line with what the Bible states about going to war? In Deuteronomy 20, for example, verses 13 to 14 talk about sieging cities, and state that when God gives the city into your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword, and the women, the children, and everything in the city can be taken as plunder. And that is effectively what happened.
You are taking those verses slightly out of context, though, as the few verses directly in front of it indicate that such actions were to be taken if the people had turned down the terms of peace that were offered. But in Muhammad bin Ishaq's report, it seems as though that approach was what was taken even when the tribe peacefully surrendered. And it might seem like a minor point, but verses 19 to 20 mention not cutting down trees, unless they aren't fruit trees and are being cut down for siege works. But Muhammad bin Ishaq reported that when sieging the Al-Nadir tribe, Muhammad cut down their palm trees and burnt them, and Medina was known for its date palms. Therefore, it seems that not only were these trees destroyed and not for siege works, but also they were fruit trees. Therefore, if those reports were true, it doesn't seem to me that it would be fair to say that Muhammad was simply following what it said in the Bible. Anyway, from the Ibn Ishaq report, it doesn't seem as though the rabbis of Medina that supposedly set the questions for Muhammad thought that his answers indicated he was a prophet.
Does the Ibn Ishaq report specifically state that?
No, but I have considered that the Ibn Ishaq report might be a piece of Islamic propaganda, perhaps written for a patron who profited from the people holding certain beliefs. As I mentioned, it doesn't make sense to me that people who believed in God would go against a prophet they thought was from God. It does make sense if they thought he was a false prophet, however, and if they considered him to have given incorrect answers to those questions, then I imagine they would have considered him a false prophet. Ibn Ishaq does report another situation similar to when the rabbis from Medina gave the Quraysh tribe questions to test Muhammad with. But in this similar situation, the rabbis come to Muhammad directly, wanting to ask him 4 questions. On this occasion, though, Muhammad gets them to take an oath that if he answers the questions correctly, they will believe in him and acknowledge his truth. They then begin asking the questions, and after each answer they state that they agree, and finally they get to the 4th question, where they ask Muhammad to tell them about the Spirit. And according to the report, Muhammad answers with the question, "Do you not know that it is Gabriel, he who comes to me?" And again they agree, but state, "O Muhammad, he is an enemy to us, an angel who comes only with violence and shedding of blood, and were it not for that we would follow you." And the report indicates that it was in response to what they said that chapter 2 verse 97 of the Quran was sent down. On the face of it, the report seems to explain how the rabbis from Medina didn't end up following Muhammad, even when he gave the correct answers. Because in the report of the rabbis directly questioning him, they take an oath that they will believe in him if he answers correctly. They agree to every answer he gives. And yet they seem to go back on their word and don't end up following him. And it seems to suggest that the rabbis from Medina could be thought to be just like them. But when I looked more closely at the report, it just didn't seem right. The first question was about why a boy can resemble his mother when the semen comes from the man. Muhammad gives an answer to which they agree, but it isn't clear to me how they could tell whether the answer was correct or not. And it seems to me that the answer wasn't correct. The report has Muhammad's answer being that the seed of the man and the seed of the woman are both liquids, and whether a male child resembles the male or the female depends which comes to the top. But as I understand it, it isn't which liquid comes to the top. It is that the genes will mix, and the child will inherit features from both.
The answer does mention the seed of the man and the seed of the woman, though. Is that not itself ahead of its time?
No, for example, Lucretius, who was a poet and philosopher from the Epicurean school of thought from the 1st century BC, had stated a similar thing in Book 4 of his poetic work, The Nature of Things. He actually handled more cases, giving an explanation for when the children seem a mix of both father and mother, and also tried to explain them perhaps having features their grandparents or great-grandparents had.
Okay, so supposing we accept that the account of the rabbis asking Muhammad the 4 questions was simply added in as propaganda, and never actually happened. What difference? There is surely no need for a follower to believe every story about Muhammad. The account isn't in the Quran itself.
You're right, but it would seem strange if the account is a total fiction. because the third question was, "Tell us about what Israel voluntarily forbade himself." And the report has Muhammad answering, "Do you not know that the food he loved best was the flesh and milk of camels, and that once when he was ill, God restored him to health, so he deprived himself of his favorite food and drink in gratitude to God," which the report has the rabbis agreeing to. The problem I have with them agreeing to it is that as far as I know there is no mention of Jacob, or Israel as he was later called, foregoing the flesh and milk of camels in the Torah. So how could they agree? Where would they be getting the information from? Not only that, but the Bible does indicate in Genesis 28 verses 20 to 22 that Jacob did voluntarily give up something, a tenth of his future wealth, if God would be with him. And it is easy to imagine that the rabbis were simply asking Muhammad what Jacob had voluntarily given up. Though I also recognize the possibility that Muhammad may have already have spoken chapter 3 verse 93 of the Quran, in which it is mentioned that Israel had made some food unlawful to himself, and that the rabbis might have heard he had stated such a thing and come to ask him about it. Though had that have been the case, then unless they hadn't heard the whole verse, I would have thought they would have addressed the challenge in it, because the verse states that all food was lawful unto the children of Israel, save that which Israel forbade himself, before the Torah was revealed, and seems to offer the challenge, produce the Torah and read it if ye are truthful. Because if they had have heard about that challenge, then they might have been expected to have brought the Torah and questioned Muhammad about Genesis chapter 9. Because while verse 3 states that every moving thing that is alive shall be food for them, verse 4 indicates that they were not permitted to eat flesh with its blood, and thus, verse 4 seems prohibit the eating of a well-cooked steak where the blood hadn't been drained, for example, or a well-cooked blood sausage made from a single animal which also contained the ground-up flesh. One defense against the idea that the well-cooked steak or blood sausage wasn't a food forbidden to the children of Israel would seem to be the claim that the prohibition in Genesis 9 verse 4 only applied to Noah and his sons, and thus not their wives or descendants, based on the idea that verse 1 indicates that God was talking to Noah and his sons. But there seems to me to be a problem with that suggestion, and why I assume Christians and Jewish people don't interpret the verses that way. It is that in the first verse they are told to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. But how could Noah and his sons be expected to have enough children to fill the earth? How many children were their wives going to have? It seems to me to suggest that the command applied to them and their descendants, that over numerous generations they were to multiply and fill the earth. But if it applied to their descendants, as Christians, for example, tend to assume, then the food prohibition would also apply to the descendants, and then those foods mentioned earlier would seem to have been prohibited for the children of Israel, which creates a problem for me justifying to God, believing that the Torah doesn't indicate that there were any foods which were prohibited to the children of Israel. And as I indicated, if the rabbis were posing the question before Muhammad had said verse 93 of chapter 3 of the Quran, then, as I said, it would be easy to imagine that they were asking about what Jacob had voluntarily given up, and wouldn't have thought Muhammad's answer about camel's flesh and milk was correct.
Okay, let's move on. So there are some writings in the Quran which seem to reference accounts which you would have otherwise considered fictional. You gave the examples of Jesus as a child breathing onto a clay bird and bringing it to life, and the sleeper account. And you've outlined a difficulty you have with believing verse 93 of chapter 3. Are there any parts of the Quran itself that you feel you would have a problem justifying to God believing?
Yes. For example, according to the Pickthall translation, in chapter 27, verse 16, it states that Solomon had been taught the language of the birds, and later verses 18 to 19 indicate that he had also been given the ability to understand the communications of ants. The problem I have isn't that he should be given such abilities. They are explainable as miracles. The problem I have is believing that once being able to understand them, the ants and birds were saying the type of things described. For example, verse 18 has an ant communicating to other ants, and in the communication identifies Solomon by name. And while ants are able to communicate by sound, I have a difficulty in believing they communicate human names. Likewise, verses 20 to 26 tell of how a hoopoe bird came back from Sheba and gave a report on the people and the queen there. Again, the problem I have with believing it is not the idea of Solomon being able to understand the bird. It's that the bird understood the concept of human territories and had a name for the one it was reporting on. and being able to discern not only that the people were worshipping, but also what they were worshipping. The bird and the ant seem to be talking like animals do in fables. And the problem I have is justifying to God believing that they do communicate like that and do have those types of concepts. And there are other things apart from the fable, like communications of animals, the reactions of people. For example, in the same chapter, chapter 27, it is described how Solomon sent the Queen of Sheba a letter telling her to come to him in submission, but how instead she sent a gift. And how in response, Solomon told her messengers that they should return because his group were going to come to them with soldiers and humiliatingly expel them from their land. Then Solomon is reported as asking the jinn which of them would bring him her throne before she came to him in submission. Two offered. One said that it would bring it before Solomon stood up, and the other said that it would bring it before Solomon's glance returns to him, and that Solomon then saw the throne placed before him. The problem I have with justifying believing that to God is that if Solomon had authority over so many jinn, he could easily have changed the world to worshipping God. He could simply have sent the jinn to the various kingdoms to explain that the reason such powerful creatures as themselves obeyed Solomon was because God exists and had given Solomon power over them, and that people should worship God. It would just seem like such an obvious thing to do, that even a child in his court could have questioned why he wasn't doing it. If a Chinese person were to ask why didn't Solomon send a jinn to the emperor of China to let the emperor know about the existence of God, then I would find it hard to find a plausible answer. What could I say? That I thought it was plausible that it didn't occur to him, or any of those around him, to use the jinn to get maps drawn up of what kingdoms there were and give messages to their leaders? And it isn't just chapter 27 that mentions the jinn under Solomon. They are also mentioned in chapter 34, verses 12 to 13. From the Pickthall translation, it seems as though the jinn made for Solomon whatever he willed, and he willed numerous things. If a Jewish person said that they didn't believe in the Quran because if jinn had built stuff for Solomon it would have been mentioned in the Bible, then I would find it hard to argue against that reasoning. Especially since 1 Kings chapters 5 to 6 go into quite a bit of detail about Solomon's planning and building of the temple, and 1 Kings 7 goes into quite a bit of detail about the building of his palace, and neither report mentions anything about jinn helping out. And if jinn had have helped build things for Solomon, then I would have expected the Israelites to have mentioned it in a report. Actually, I would have expected non-Israelites to be invited to witness the gift of power over these beings that God had bestowed on Solomon, so that they would never dare attack the Israelites again, and that it would have been a story that would have been passed down from generation to generation, as well as appearing in the Bible. I find it difficult to justify to God believing jinn did help, because if it had happened, I would have expected the Israelites to have gone on about the jinn, even if it meant missing out the details of what Solomon gave to Hiram in terms of wheat and pure oil, and how Hiram gave to Solomon the cedar and juniper timber he required, or how Solomon conscripted laborers.
So those are your main difficulties in believing in the Quran. That firstly, the accounts of some animals bear a resemblance to animals in fables, in that they seem to have a human vocabulary. And that secondly, if it was as some of the reports suggest, that you would have expected the written history in the Bible to have been different?
Those are a couple of the difficulties I have, yes, but my problem isn't limited to those.
Could you give us another example?
Well, another example may be one which is simply a translation issue. Some translations seem to suggest that God is the most merciful, while at the same time promising that the people that don't believe in what Muhammad is saying would burn in hell for eternity. Take, for example, a Jewish person that didn't believe the Quran was completely the word of God because he thought that if jinn had have built stuff for Solomon, then it would have been reported in the Hebrew Bible. It seems to me a reasonable consideration, that it wouldn't be the type of thing that people would forget to mention. Even if he was wrong, it isn't clear to me why he should have guessed he was. There are people that feel that murderers shouldn't be tortured, and therefore I assume they wouldn't, if it were up to them, sentence that Jewish person to burning for eternity, even if he had been mistaken about jinn building stuff for Solomon, because he had assumed that if they had, it would have been mentioned in 1 Kings chapters 5 to 7, and therefore since I believe people, myself included, would not have sentenced that person to burn for even 5 minutes if he had made a mistake, then it seems to me such people would be more merciful than those that would sentence him to burn for eternity. Therefore, I don't know how I could justify to God believing God is both the most merciful and that it would burn such a person for eternity.
You don't believe in hell?
I do believe in hell.
You don't believe God is the most merciful?
I do believe God is the most merciful.
Haven't you just contradicted yourself?
No, because I don't believe that God inflicts hell. I believe Satan does. And that people in hell have rejected the Holy Spirit and have embraced the unholy spirit, so to speak. But if you want to discuss my beliefs, then perhaps do it in a separate episode.
Okay, I can see you have some difficulties in justifying to God believing the text based on some of what it states. But if you were to be shown clear proofs in the Quran that the text was from God, then wouldn't that simplify the justification matter? Wouldn't you change your mind?
Yes, of course. But there would be a distinction between proving that the Quran was inspired by a being of greater than human intelligence and proving it was from God. I've read or heard of Christians, for example, accepting the idea of supernatural design in the Quran, but considering it to be from Satan. Though personally, I am not aware of any evidence of it being inspired by a being of greater than human intelligence that I would expect to be accepted by an atheist.
But isn't that kind of circular? If an atheist accepted the evidence, they wouldn't be an atheist, surely.
The kind of evidence that would make them seriously consider that an advanced alien life form had used the Quran to interfere with history on Earth, for example.
Isn't the Quran supposed to contain clear proofs that it is from God?
I'm not an expert on the Quran, but I'm not aware of the Quran stating that it contains a clear proof, only that clear proofs have been sent. And it seems possible that the miracles performed by other prophets were those clear proofs. And in chapter 6, verses 43 to 44, it seems as though it is being stated that previously the messengers had been inspired with clear proofs and writings, but that what had been revealed to Muhammad was a remembrance which could explain to mankind that which had been revealed to them and which they could reflect upon. And in chapter 6, verses 57 to 58, it seems as though Muhammad is being told to say that while he personally has clear proof from his Lord, he hasn't a clear proof for those that deny his Lord, because if he had, then the dispute would have already been decided. I'm interpreting those verses that way because while verse 58 doesn't specifically mention a proof, but instead mentions what they were impatient for, I am assuming that what they were impatient for was a proof. And the early verses of chapter 6 seem to support that idea. Because verse 7, for example, seems to be suggesting how even if they were sent down writing upon parchment, they would still disbelieve and say that it was nothing but magic. I assume the miracle there would have involved the parchment being seen to come down from the sky by those wishing for a sign. Verse 8 seems to mention disbelievers asking why an angel hasn't been sent down to Muhammad, presumably in a way in which they could all see it. The remainder of the verse, and verse 9, doesn't seem to me to be an explanation of why an angel wasn't sent down, because the remainder of verse 8 seems to suggest that if an angel were sent down, then everyone would be judged at that point, and that they wouldn't have any further time for reflection. And while at first glance that might seem like an explanation, in that it could be thought that it wasn't desirable that they didn't have further time for reflection, on further consideration it can be understood that the decision to have judged them and given them no further time for reflection would be a separate decision, and there is no explanation for why that additional decision would have been made if it wasn't desirable. And then, in the next verse, verse 9, it seems to suggest that if Muhammad had been appointed an angel, then the angel would have been made to appear as a man. But again, that would seem to be a separate decision, and there doesn't seem to be any explanation as to why the decision to have made it appear as a man would have been made. Therefore, the verses don't explain to me why it was decided that an angel shouldn't appear clearly as an angel, as a sign for the disbelievers that what Muhammad had been saying was from God, without changing when judgment was going to occur. The sense I get from the verses is that human beings had already been given clear proofs, and they wouldn't be getting any more, and should reflect on the proofs that humanity had already been given. But as I've said, I'm not an expert on the matter, and there seem to be people that have studied the Quran far more than me, that have claimed that there are clear proofs in the Quran that it is from God. Though I think I should mention that what they seem to be assuming is that evidence of design, or what they consider to be evidence which is unexplainable as being of human design, and of which an explanation of coincidence would be implausible, is necessarily proof that the Quran is from God. However, I might be wrong, but I imagine some Christians, for example, could still interpret such evidence, if it existed, as being evidence that it was inspired by Satan. The only reason I mention it is simply to point out that logically, evidence of design which wasn't plausibly done by humans doesn't imply that it must have been done by God. But personally, I accept that if there was such evidence, it would make it easy for followers to justify to God believing it was from God, such that the lottery issue would no longer be an issue for them. However, I'm not personally aware of any such evidence, even though, as I mentioned, I've watched people that have presumably studied the Quran far more than me claim that the Quran does indeed contain clear proofs that it is from God.
Could you perhaps give an example of a claim of a proof which you don't accept as a proof?
Sure, for example, I've seen videos claiming that chapter 29 verse 41 is a clear sign that the Quran is from God. The idea that they seem to put across is to claim that science has recently discovered that female spiders are the ones that make the web, and that the verse specifies that it is referring to a female spider. The idea being that the truths in the Quran were ahead of scientific discovery, and therefore it is miraculous and a clear proof. The problem I have with the claim is that, as I understand it, both male and female spiders can make webs. It is just that the male spiders tend not to be territorial and move around in search of females, and when doing so don't make webs because they aren't staying in one place. I've seen the claim accompanied by the claim that the verse isn't just talking about the frailty of the construction of the house itself, but about how it isn't a place of security, because it is a trap, and that a weak home is one that doesn't provide security, and that it isn't only insects that can be caught in the web, but also the house isn't a place of security for the male spider when it visits. But the verse seems to be about the similarity to a female spider that takes a house, not the similarity to insects or male spiders.
But are spiders' webs the frailest of houses?
I don't know. They are noticeably frail. Their frailty could be thought to have been commented on before in Job 8 verses 13 to 15. So are the paths of all who forget God, and the hope of the godless will perish. His confidence is fragile, and his trust is a spider's web. He depends on his house, but it does not stand. He holds on to it, but it does not endure. I feel I should mention that though the word web appears in the New American Standard Bible, the word used in the Hebrew text seems to me to be commonly translated as house or household, not specifically a web. Likewise, a word for a web doesn't seem to be specifically used in the Quran. And the Pickthall translation suggests that the verse is about a house that a spider takes. And as I understand it, some spiders can sometimes make their homes in burrows abandoned by small mammals, for example, which would seem to make their home at least as sturdy as the home of such small mammals. Though other English translations could be thought to suggest that the scope of the verse is restricted to what is built by the spider itself. And with that idea, the house of the small mammal that a spider might take wouldn't count. But still, as I understand it, only about half of spider species make webs. And amongst the other types of houses that other species of spiders can make are burrows in the ground. Trapdoor spiders, for example, can burrow into the ground. And as I understand it, some can burrow up to 30 to 40 centimeters deep, with some having more than one entrance, which doesn't seem too frail. A bird's egg in a spider's tunnel would presumably have more protection from being stood on than an egg in a nest on the ground, for example. If the verse was thought to somehow only apply to spider webs, there are other houses, such as that of the meadow spittlebug nymph, for example, which is simply a nest of bubbles. It might be that those bubbles are more stable than a spider's web, I don't know. But even if they are, I don't know how it would be a clear sign that the verse was a clear sign from God, given that the spider's webs had probably been thought of as flimsy for quite a while.
Can you possibly give us another example then?
Sure. There is a claim that the account of fetal development in verse 14 of chapter 23 is way before its time, and therefore the Quran must have been divinely inspired. But Hippocrates of Kos lived in the late 5th, early 4th century BCE, and had given a quite detailed account of fetal development. And his work was further expounded upon by Claudius Galenus, also known as Galen, in the 2nd century CE. And commentators have commented on the similarity between Galen's account and the account found in the Quran. Therefore, since even the Galen account had been around for about 400 years before the account in the Quran was available, I don't know how the Quran containing a similar account can be considered as evidence that the message was from God. And as I understand it, Islamic scholars in the 14th century noticed the similarity between Galen's account and that in the Quran. The similarities are such that other people suggested that Galen's account may have been a source for the account in the Quran. Personally, I'm able to see some similarities between Galen's account and that in the Quran, as well as some differences. The most notable difference is that Galen's account splits the development into 4 parts, while the description in the Quran splits the development into 6 stages. But in his first book on semen, Galen mentions that in the first stage, the early form is like semen, and in the second stage writes about it filling with blood and then having the form of flesh. And in the third stage suggests bones appearing and mentions flesh growing on and around the bones, and mentioning that it is at the fourth stage that Hippocrates no longer considered the fetus to be an embryo only, but already a child. Therefore, I am able to see mentions in Galen's description, which seem to correspond to the 6 stages outlined in the Quran.
But is Muhammad not widely considered to have been illiterate?
As I understand it, that is a widely held view, yes.
Then how are you suggesting Muhammad could have possibly known about Galen's work?
Just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that he did, but God knows that it is not like I can't imagine an alternative account. My point is that unless I can write off that alternative, or other alternatives that people can imagine, then how can I justify to God believing that such an account appearing in the Quran is a proof that the Quran is from God?
Well, what alternative are you imagining?
I can imagine lots of alternatives.
Well, give us just one.
Okay, but just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the alternative account is correct. And while some people might find it difficult to even consider this alternative account, my point is that if I'm going to justify to God believing that the Quran is 100% the Word of God, then I want to be able to state that I seriously examined the possibility that it wasn't, that I seriously cared whether it was or wasn't. Okay, that said, here is the alternative account that I'm imagining. That the father of Muhammad's first wife, Khadijah, had during his travels as a trader become familiar with Greek texts and Roman culture, which led to him using carrier pigeons to give him an advantage over his competitors in business. That he intended for Khadijah to take over the family business and made sure she was educated. That while she would not have the physical fighting prowess of her male competitors, she would be more educated in Greek and Roman thought than them. And that it was through the texts that she learnt about Epicurus. Epicurus, if you remember, was that Greek philosopher I mentioned in our conversation about Christianity. The one that suggested that if gods did exist, they didn't care what the people did. I was assuming Constantine was an Epicurean, if you remember.
I remember, and I hope you don't mind me saying, but this is all starting to sound very speculative.
It is speculative. It is just an example of one alternative that I could imagine. I'm not claiming it to be correct.
Okay, please continue.
That the writings of Epicurean philosophers led Khadijah to view the priests as simply using stories of gods to manipulate the weak-minded. That while she pretended to be pious and worshipped the head god of the tribe and his 3 daughters, she didn't believe in them. Instead, she considered their worshipping of the gods a sign of their ignorance. No amount of praying would lead to even a grain of sand being levitated. That she had heard of the God of Israel, but considered it to just be another fictional creation by men, invented to control the weak-minded. That influenced by the writings of Epicurus, Khadijah had thoughts of taking advantage of the men's ignorance to control them. I should just point out that as I understand it, Khadijah wasn't just your average Qurayshi trader. I understand it as being reported that her caravan was about the size of all the other traders from her tribe put together. And as explained in this alternative account, that was due to her father becoming aware of Roman culture and the use of carrier pigeons, allowing him to communicate with his buyers what they wanted and at what price he would deliver it, before his caravan had even left Mecca. How useful such knowledge had been to him was what led him to acquiring books, and having his daughter secretly educated in Greek and Latin to give her an advantage over other members of the tribe. Which would explain how the writings of Galen could be known about. Anyway, in the alternative account, Muhammad came to her attention, an uneducated, trustworthy man, several years younger than herself, who had been orphaned at a young age, and hadn't been taught to scheme or look out for schemes by the men that looked after him as a child, in order that their own children might have an advantage over him. That Muhammad seemed to Khadijah to be the perfect front man for her plan, known to be trustworthy by the men of the tribe, as well as making an ideal young husband who would listen to her rather than try to control her. A husband she could educate as she desired, and if her plan went horribly wrong, a man that would take the fall for her. That Khadijah married Muhammad and taught him to read and write, and taught him about Epicurus. That Muhammad as a young man had no answer to Epicurus's arguments, which enabled Khadijah to convince him that if gods exist, They don't care what humans do. And under pressure from his wife, Muhammad took steps on the path towards becoming a so-called great man. Great in the sense that Alexander of Macedon was considered a great man, or Constantine. And it isn't like there is no report in which Muhammad seems to think he can write. There are collections of oral reports about what was said by Muhammad and those around him, known as hadith. One of the earliest collections is known as Sahih al-Bukhari. And within it, report number 5669 is about Muhammad on his deathbed wanting to write a statement for them so that they will not go astray. But Umar, a companion of Muhammad who would later become the second caliph, said that Muhammad was seriously ill and that because they had the Quran, they didn't need the statement. That the people then quarreled, until eventually Muhammad told them to go away. It seems strange to me that a person should think they could write when they couldn't. And it also seems strange to me that Umar didn't seem to want Muhammad to attempt to write anything, so much so that he was prepared to quarrel over it. If Umar believed Muhammad couldn't write, then why not give him something to write with and something to write on? If Muhammad then couldn't write, Umar could say, "See, he is seriously ill, he can't write." Why quarrel about it? What is curious is why Umar was so keen that Muhammad wasn't given the opportunity to attempt to write. What made Umar so certain he wasn't going to witness a miracle?
Your alternative account has an explanation, I assume.
That several of Muhammad's companions were also introduced to what Epicurus had been saying, and that Umar was among them, and he was worried that Muhammad was going to write a deathbed confession.
You're imagining Muhammad was going to write a confession?
No, I'm imagining Umar thought he was going to.
So does your alternative account have any suggestion over what he was going to write? Or are you just saying, whatever it was, he wasn't going to write a confession?
In the alternative account, I'm imagining it was the insurance policy.
The insurance policy?
I'm imagining that Muhammad's wife, Khadijah, knew that the first verse of the first chapter of Genesis was linked quite strongly to the number 37.
In what way?
Hebrew writing, like Greek and Arabic, used certain letters to represent certain numbers, which meant that each word in Genesis 1 verse 1 could be given a numeric value based on the letters it contained. Genesis 1 verse 1 contains 7 words, and if you were to add up the values of these 7 words, they add up to 2,701. 2,701 has 2 factors, the prime numbers 37 and 73. In other words, the only pair of whole numbers, other than 1 and 2,701, which could be multiplied together to make 2,701, are 37 and 73. Furthermore, with at least one word value, and each word value being included once or not at all, there are 127 possible combinations of adding those 7 word values together. Out of those 127 combinations, 23 are divisible by the prime number 37. The really weird thing is when you tally up how many times each of the 7 words appears in those 23 combinations, which were divisible by 37, because the tally for each word is 12. Each word appears the same number of times in those combinations. It seems strange. And that is the strange connection I'm imagining Khadijah knew existed between Genesis 1 verse 1 and the number 37.
I didn't know that. But okay, let's for the sake of discussion imagine Khadijah did know about it. Presumably she wouldn't be the only one.
In this imagined alternative account, she isn't.
Then how would knowing that provide Khadijah with any type of insurance policy?
Well, in this alternative account, I am also imagining that another piece of information had come to her attention, that there was a sequence of numbers in which 37 was linked to another number, the Fibonacci sequence.
The Fibonacci sequence. But Fibonacci lived around the 12th or 13th century. So how could Khadijah come to have known it when she lived in the late 6th, early 7th century?
From what I've read, it seems to me possible that although the sequence is known as the Fibonacci sequence, it may have already been discovered in India. A 10th century writer named Halayuda describes Mount Meru, or Pascal's triangle, as it came to be known in the West, and attributed it to Sanskrit poetry and a man named Pingala, who lived in the 2nd century BCE or earlier, presumably in India. As I understand it, there has been some dispute over whether Halayuda attributed Mount Meru to the correct sutra of Pingala's. Regardless, it does seem as though the foundation of the algorithm that builds Mount Meru is found in Pingala's early work.
But what has the Fibonacci sequence got to do with Pascal's triangle?
If you take shallow diagonals through Pascal's triangle and add the numbers in that diagonal, then you get results in the form of the Fibonacci sequence. For your listeners not familiar with the Fibonacci sequence, it starts with two ones, and then the next number is always the total of the two previous numbers. So it would be 1, 1, then 2, because 2 is 1 plus 1, then 3 because 3 is 2 plus 1, then 5 because 5 is 3 plus 2, and so on. Again, as I've been given to understand it, a 7th century writer named Virahanka explicitly mentions the sequence 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, which is part of the Fibonacci sequence, and gives an alternative Mount Meru from that described by Halayuda, one that is missing the pyramid cap of Pascal's triangle, and instead starts with the two ones. If you were to take the shallow diagonals through that, then you would get the sequence 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. It would be missing the first one because it was missing the pyramid cap. And as I understand it, that sequence relates to Sanskrit poetry. If you were to think of short syllables taking one beat and long syllables taking two, that for one beat there would be one permutation, for two beats 2, for 3, 3, for 4, 5 for 5, 8, and so on, like the Fibonacci sequence, but missing the initial one. But as I understand it, with the Mount Meru described by Halayuda, which he attributed to Sanskrit poetry, and Pingala, who lived around the 2nd century BCE or earlier, then if that was used with the shallow diagonals, it would have the initial one, and would give the Fibonacci sequence. Anyway, just to be clear, there is no explicit mention as far as I know in the Indian texts of the Fibonacci sequence from the start of it. But I'm not trying to prove that it had been discovered in India. I'm just considering the possibility that it was known, and that Muhammad's wife, Khadijah, came to know it, and its link to the number 37.
So what was its link?
That every 19th number in the Fibonacci sequence is divisible by the prime number 37. The number 37 being the prime number with the link to Genesis 1 verse 1 that I mentioned earlier.
And how would that provide her with an insurance policy, so to speak?
From what I've read, chapter 74 was one of the first chapters recited by Muhammad. As I understand it, it is supposed to be the fourth he recited. In it, it indicates that Judgment Day will not be one of ease for the disbelievers, and verses 30 and 31 tell of how there are 19 angels above the fire, and that their number would be a stumbling block for those that disbelieve, that it would give those who had been given the scripture certainty, and that believers would be able to increase in faith, that those that disbelieved would not understand what God meant by the number, and that what had been said was a reminder to mortals. I'm imagining the disbelievers amongst the tribe members would have thought it was just an idle threat, but like the verses stated, they wouldn't have known what was meant by the number. But in the imagined alternative account, if a serious enough challenge were offered to Muhammad, then Muhammad could ask for a few days while he asked God for a sign. Then sure enough, the number would appear to be a stumbling block for them, as Muhammad revealed the link between Genesis 1 verse 1 and the number 37, and also the link between the number 37 and the number 19 mentioned in those verses, thus showing a mathematical connection between the Quran and the Torah that the followers wouldn't imagine Muhammad, the illiterate orphan, could possibly have known. Thus I imagine that if such a thing had have occurred, the followers would have grown in faith like verse 31 suggested.
Okay, well, we've gone quite a way off the Quranic account of fetal development there. And just to bring it back, you aren't saying that it isn't miraculous, but you are saying that you can imagine an alternative, right? That Muhammad's wife was educated and could have been familiar with Galen's work.
Well, firstly, I was pointing out that I don't know how to justify to God claiming the account of fetal development found in the Quran is proof that it was from God, when by the time of Muhammad, an account like that had been around for hundreds of years. I then gave an example alternative account, after you questioned me about how Muhammad could have possibly known about Galen's work, when it was widely accepted he was illiterate. But other scenarios could be imagined. For example, that someone else had known at least an outline of Galen's work on that point, and had told him. Muhammad wouldn't have had to have read Galen's work himself or known it in great detail in order to have given the level of detail found in the Quran.
Okay, but since you've brought up the issue about the number 19 with your insurance policy imagining, aren't there supposed miracles in the Quran directly linked to that number?
By the way, I'm not claiming to have discovered the link between the Fibonacci sequence and 37, or the link between 37 and Genesis 1 verse 1. I had read about them, and knew about 19 being mentioned in the Quran. But regarding your question about other links between the Quran and the number 19, yes, I've seen quite a few reported, but they seem to fall into one of two categories. They either seem to show design but not design, which is beyond human capability at the time, or they don't show design because they can be explained by probability theory. For example, I've seen videos which start off with the ones that seem to show design but can be easily be explained away as human design. And then it seems, once the idea of design has been accepted, continue on to links between the text and 19, which would have required extreme effort, or to be effectively beyond human capabilities at the time, the idea seemingly to be to suggest divine design. But the later ones seem to me to be explainable by probability theory, or in other words, what you would expect given chance, and therefore don't seem to indicate design.
So could you give an example of a claimed link between the Quran and the number 19, which you think could be explained by human design?
As I've been given to understand it, there are 114 named chapters in the Quran, and 114 is a number that is divisible by 19. And since 19 is a prime number, I would have thought that if you were to pick a number at random, there would be roughly a 1 in 19 chance that it was divisible by 19. The first verse of the first named chapter has 19 letters, and the number values of those 19 letters add up to 786, which is also divisible by 19. Also, that same verse appears 114 times in the Quran. It appears before the verses in every chapter apart from chapter 1 and chapter 9. But as mentioned, the text appears in chapter 1 anyway, and it also appears in chapter 27, verse 30. Therefore, while it isn't found in front of two chapters, that is made up for by it appearing in the body of text of two chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 27. And if you count chapter 9, the chapter the verse it is missing from, as 1, and count from there, then chapter 27, the chapter that contains the verse twice, would be 19. Another is that the 96th chapter, which is traditionally regarded as the first chapter that was revealed, has 19 verses, which contain 304 letters, and 304 is divisible by 19. Another is to do with a link between the initials that, as I understand it, are found at the start of 29 of the 114 named chapters. As I understand it, chapter 19 is initialed with 5 letters, and if you counted the occurrence of each of those letters within the chapter and then added them together, the total comes to 798, and 798 is divisible by 19. A further example is that 6 chapters are initialed with the letters HM, but chapter 42 also contains the letters HM in the initials associated with it. And if you go through all 7 of those chapters and add the number of occurrences of the letter H to the number of occurrences of the letter M, then they add up to 2,147, which is divisible by 19. As mentioned, chapter 42 had extra initials compared to the other 6 of those 7 verses. And if you add up the occurrence of those extra letters in chapter 42, then that count also adds up to a figure divisible by 19. Chapter 36 is prefixed with 2 initials, and the count for both within the chapter is divisible by 19. 3 chapters contain the letter S in their initials, chapters 7, 19, and 38. If you ignore the other initials and just count the total for S in those chapters, it is 152, and 152 is divisible by 19. Chapters 42 and 50 contain the initial Q in their initials, and if you add up the total for Q, it is 114, which is divisible by 19. Another one is that the Quran mentions 30 whole numbers and 8 fractions. 30 plus 8 equals 38, and 38 is divisible by 19. Also, if you add the 30 whole numbers together, they add up to 162,146. And, you guessed it, 162,146 is divisible by 19.
And you feel that all of those examples you gave can be explained as being by human design?
I'm not claiming that they are because of human design, but there doesn't seem to me to be anything in them that seems beyond it.
Well, take the example you gave, of where there are connections between the number count of the letters signified by the initials before the chapter and the number 19. Don't you think it would be difficult to keep count of all the letter counts while making the point you wanted to make so that once the point is made, the letter count would be divisible by 19?
Humans can achieve difficult things, but I think there is probably an easier way to do it than the way you were imagining. I imagine, for example, that it is likely you could get a random book or magazine and select 20 random pages. Then make a letter count for each letter on each page. And on pages where the letter count for one or more letters was divisible by 19, write those letters at the top of the page. The point is that the letter counts needn't even be a consideration when writing the thing. But some people might say at this point, but you have oversimplified. You mentioned chapters 42 and 50 contain the initial Q in their initials, and if you add up the total for Q, it is 114, which is divisible by 19. But what you didn't also mention is that there were 57 Q characters in each chapter, and 57 is also divisible by 19, and chapter 42 has 53 verses, and 42 plus 53 equals 95, and 95 is divisible by 19. Likewise, chapter 50 has 45 verses, and 50 plus 45 also equals 95, and so is also divisible by 19, so it isn't as simple as you make out. But it isn't like this is the case for all the letters. And as I understand it, the surahs weren't numbered under Muhammad, which leaves us just with the point that there were 57 Q or Qaf characters in both chapter 42 and chapter 50. Leaving the chance of coincidence aside, imagine the random writing example given earlier. Now imagine that you can also modify the text for one of the letter counts to connect it even more to the number 19. You could just pick the one that seems easiest to modify and modify that. Hardly beyond human capability. While I don't have a problem accepting that the connection between the initials and the counts does seem like evidence of design, I don't know how I could justify to God thinking that it was a design beyond human capability, and if God was going to give a sign, why not make it a design beyond human capability, such that it would actually act as a sign?
What about the one with the 30 numbers mentioned in the Quran, which when added up are divisible by 19?
Again, I don't think it's that hard. You can just keep doubling the number, in this case 19, writing it down each time. And then just select a few of the numbers from the list in order to get a big number that was divisible by 19. Then just make up numbers and take those away from the big number that you have and see how much you have left to go. I've done a similar thing by hand for the number 31. I just kept doubling it until I felt I had got high enough to have a big number divisible by 31. I just took one number from the list, but I could have taken some others as well, and added them to it, as the total would always be divisible by 31, which is all I am looking for, a big number divisible by 31. I can then just make up some numbers that I think will be useful, add them up, and take the total away from the figure I am trying to get to, seeing how much I have left to go. I can make some adjustments if I need to. I just want to end up with no remainder after I have taken all the figures away from the big number I had that was divisible by 31. Once I've done that, then I've got a list of numbers which will add up to the value of a large number which is divisible by the prime number 31. While I didn't time it, I don't think it took me an hour. Your listeners could try it for themselves with some other prime numbers to see how long it takes them.
So what numbers did you end up using?
The numbers from 1 to 13, then 19, 50, 100, 250, 365, 500, 600, 700, 800, 1,000, 2,500, 10,000, 20,000, 40,000, 50,000, and a 1/2, a 1/3, and a 1/6. I included the fractions in the total. Altogether, they add up to 126,976, which is divisible by 31, and there are 31 of them. Therefore, while I can consider the whole numbers used in the Quran adding up to a number divisible by 19 as evidence of design when combined with other things to do with 19 in the Quran, I don't know how to justify to God believing it was evidence of being beyond human design, because it was pretty easy to do something similar with the number 31.
But you haven't incorporated those into a text.
No, I haven't, but I don't think it would be beyond human capability to do so.
Do you think that it might just be a case of that no matter what link was shown, you'd always just say, okay, I accept that it seems like evidence of design, but not evidence that the design was beyond human capability?
No, because supposing the numbers in the Quran had added up to 80,263, or that the Quran had 80,263 words, or even more convincing, would be to have both. 80,263 is a prime number, and because it is a prime number, I can't use that doubling method to get to it. Because being a prime number, it's not divisible by 19. But that doesn't mean it hasn't any links to the number 19. It has. For starters, it's a prime number whose individual digits add up to 19. 8 plus 0 plus 2 plus 6 plus 3 equals 19. Not only is it a prime number whose digits add up to 19, it is the 676th prime number whose digits add up to 19. the first being 199. And the digits in 676 also add up to 19. And of those prime numbers, whose digits add up to 19, and have an order number in the order of such numbers, in which the digits of the order number also add up to 19, it is the 19th. The first being 16,561, which is the 199th prime number whose digits add up to 19. So 80,263 would not only incorporate 19 in a way that it wouldn't seem plausible to believe was coincidental, but I also think it would be hard to arrive at without the use of a computer. I haven't tried, but I can't imagine working that out by hand within an hour. I used a computer to get the result on that one. Plus, as I understand it, like with the Hebrew of Genesis 1 verse 1 we discussed, the Arabs at the time used letters for numbers, with different letters having different values, rather than a system in which the value of the number depends on where the digit comes in the order of the number. And though the base 10 number system we use became known in Europe as the Arabic numeral system. As I understand it, it was invented in India around the 6th and 7th century CE and didn't get adopted in Arabia until a couple of hundred years later. Therefore, apart from the difficulty in arriving at the number, there would be the additional question of why a human constructor of the Quran, even if they were somehow aware of the Indian numeral system, would choose to embed mathematical links to 19 which relied on it. How would they know that it would eventually become popular around the world? Thus, personally, I would have considered use of the number 80,263 as stronger evidence of non-human design than anything I am currently aware of in the Quran.
But couldn't you say the same about Genesis 1 verse 1? That could have been created by a human, could it not? Why not have links there to the Indian numeric system?
I think it does have some links. If you remember, the number value of the words in Genesis 1 verse 1 was 2,701, which was 37 multiplied by 73. With 37 and 73 both being prime numbers. Well, in Hebrew, 37 and 73 wouldn't use the same characters. But they do in base 10, and in base 10 they are a reversible pair of numbers, meaning that the digits of one is in the reverse order of the digits of the other. Not only that, but 37 is the 12th prime number and 73 is the 21st prime number, and 12 and 21 are also a reversible pair of numbers in base 10. I should think not only is that a relatively rare property, but is a property that appears in base 10, which is what we commonly use today, and which, as I understand it, wouldn't have been known to the Hebrews at the time Genesis 1 verse 1 was first written down.
Okay, well let's get back to the number 19 in the Quran. You seem to accept that there are connections to the number 19 that do seem to indicate design. So in your imagined account, were you imagining that Muhammad and his wife added the connections to the number 19 in? And if so, why would they bother if they already had a connection such as in the Fibonacci sequence you mentioned?
Actually, in the alternative account, I was imagining that perhaps chapter 1 verse 1 or chapter 96 could have been constructed by them, but not all the rest. It would seem like too much effort. And like you say, why would they bother when they had the Fibonacci sequence connection? I was imagining the other modifications coming later. A construction by Muhammad's companions, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, all of which in this imagined alternative are imagined to be vaguely Epicurean. I was imagining that they had been told about the links to the number 19 in chapter 1 verse 1 or chapter 96, but not about the connection to the Fibonacci sequence.
Why wouldn't they have been told about the Fibonacci sequence connection?
For insurance purposes. If, for example, they had turned against Muhammad and claimed he had confided in them that he was a false prophet, Muhammad could ask for time for God to send a message so that the followers could be guided in their judgment regarding the situation. It wouldn't matter if the companions stated the connections they knew. It could be suggested that they had just spotted those connections and assumed they were the connection, and then been tempted to attempt to overthrow him. Because when accusing him of being a false prophet, how could they be wrong if they knew what the number 19 meant? After all, verse 31 of chapter 74 states that disbelievers wouldn't know what was meant by the number. And in this imagining, Muhammad's revelation of the link between 19 and Genesis 1 verse 1 would serve to show that as disbelievers, they hadn't actually understood what the number meant, as the verses had predicted, and how that number had ultimately served as a stumbling block for them, as the verses had predicted. But, on his deathbed, after they hadn't tried to usurp him, it would be safe for him to write it down and increase the followers' belief and help safeguard his offspring.
But how could his companions change the text? Weren't there people that knew it off by heart?
In this imagined alternative account, when Muhammad died, contrary to how it may be commonly thought, there was no one that fully knew what Muhammad had recited. I'm imagining that would be because illiteracy rates were quite high. And even for those that could read, there wouldn't have been access to any complete text from which to learn it. Which is why in this imagined alternative account, Sahih al-Bukhari contains numerous accounts of how Umar encouraged Abu Bakr to collect the verses of the Quran, and how Abu Bakr in turn encouraged Zayd bin Thabit to collect the Quran. Sahih al-Bukhari 7191 reports Zayd bin Thabit claiming the request being heavier for him than if he had been asked to move a mountain. But if people had known it by heart, it would have been easy. Just get one or more of them to recite it and write down what they recited. Similar reports are found in Sahih al-Bukhari 4986 and in Sahih al-Bukhari 4679, both of which also mention the finding of the last part of chapter 9 with a single person, and they aren't the only ones. The same thing is reported in Sahih al-Bukhari 4989 and 7425. And I wouldn't expect that to be the case if multiple people had known the Quran by heart. As I said, collecting it would have been an easy matter. All you would need to do is ask one or more of the people that knew it by heart. Furthermore, other reports such as Sahih al-Bukhari 2807, 4049, 4784, and 4988 have Zayd reporting that another verse 23 of chapter 33, was also found with that same person. And 4784, for example, mentions that it wasn't found with anyone else. Now, chapter 33 has 73 verses. So, unlike with the verses from chapter 9, this isn't a verse at the end of a chapter. It is a verse quite a way in, which seems to suggest that there wasn't anyone else that knew chapter 33 by heart. Again, if there were people that knew the whole Quran by heart rather than sections of it, then I wouldn't have expected any verses to have been found with a single person. And since this is only an imagined alternative, I'm going to imagine that in the Battle of Yamama, where there were many casualties amongst those who had learnt parts of the Quran, that those that had learnt parts were sent to the front on purpose. Because with them dead, it would be easier to make changes to what had been said.
But wouldn't the people have questioned the sense of having people that had memorized parts of the Quran anywhere near the front line?
Well, in the alternative, it is imagined that it was made sure that people knew the words of verse 9 of chapter 15 of the Quran, which enabled it to be suggested that it would be okay, as those that had remembered parts of the Quran would be guarded in battle, as the words they had remembered would be protected. Then, when the casualties were high, it would be explained that the words must exist elsewhere. And to show that they were, Zayd bin Thabit was given the project of putting together the Quran. And since at this point there wasn't anyone that knew the Quran by heart, and many of those that had committed pieces to memory had been killed in the battle, it meant pieces could be added and other bits missed out to strengthen the connection to the number 19. Because the connection Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman knew of wasn't that strong, because they were missing the link to the Fibonacci sequence. And in the alternative account, they had the Quran organized in a way which would make it more closely connected to the number 19, to strengthen the claim that it had come from God.
Okay, I can see how you can imagine that bits could be added. People could just think they were bits they hadn't been aware of, like those verses you mentioned. But wouldn't people notice if the bits they did remember were changed or went missing?
Well, regarding bits going missing, Sahih al-Bukhari 6830 reports Umar standing up and announcing that a verse had gone missing. The verse he mentioned was the verse concerning the stoning of those that commit adultery. He stated he was concerned that people would go astray by leaving out an obligation that they had been given. In the imagined alternative account, they weren't hiding that bits were missing. They were announcing it. So if someone came to them and said about a missing verse, they could say, "Yes, that is what we have been saying. There are verses missing from what we have managed to collect."
But doesn't that undermine your alternative account? If Umar was concerned that an obligation was left out, then would he not have thought that it was a revealed verse that had gone missing?
In the alternative account, he doesn't believe any of the verses were from God.
I understand, but In your alternative account, they are trying to create a narrative of the verses being protected. How does him suggesting that a revealed verse had gone missing support that narrative?
He isn't claiming infallibility. Later, it can just be explained that there must have been a problem with the verses that went missing, and thus it had been a type of refining process. And Umar doesn't look like part of any conspiracy, as it seems as though he had pious concerns. And it isn't only the hadith collection known as Sahih al-Bukhari that such reports are found. The hadith collection known as Sahih Muslim has a report numbered 1050, in which a different companion of Muhammad is reported as calling upon the reciters of Basra to recite the Quran to him, and then mentioning to them that there used to be 2 whole chapters that used to be recited, that the 300 reciters of Basra were missing. The companion reports that while he used to know the chapters by heart, he had forgotten them and could only remember a single verse from the first and 2 verses from the second. The verse from the first chapter he mentioned, "If there were 2 valleys full of riches for the son of Adam, he would long for a 3rd valley, and nothing would fill the stomach of the son of Adam but dust," is not found in the Quran. The 2 verses from the other chapter, though, are in the Quran, but they aren't in a single chapter. One is verse 2 of chapter 61, and the other is verse 13 of chapter 17. And in the imagined alternative, that would be because verses were also moved between chapters, with that report in Sahih Muslim giving an indication of the scale of the changes. And just as a side issue, if you remember when earlier we were discussing some of the links between number 19 and the Quran, one of them was to do with the initial cue, where chapter 42 had 53 verses and chapter 50 had 45 verses, and in each case the chapter number and number of verses it contains adds up to 95. I had mentioned that I didn't think at the time of Muhammad the chapter order had been established. And the Sahih Muslim report seems to support that, because if it had been established, the companion could have given the number or mentioned the chapters the missing chapters were in between. Anyway, the hadith report how Abu Bakr convinced Zayd bin Thabit to gather fragments of the Quran together, and that he did. They also report that after Abu Bakr died from an illness, the collection passed on to Umar, and after Umar was murdered, the collection passed on to Umar's daughter and one of Muhammad's widows, Hafsa. Sahih al-Bukhari 4987 then reports how the people of Sham and the people of Iraq had differences in the way they recited the Quran, which caused a companion of Muhammad to come to Uthman to sort it out before the people started differing about the book as the Jews and Christians did before, which led Uthman to send a message to Hafsa to send him the manuscripts so that he could make copies and then return the manuscripts to her. Uthman is said to have got 3 Quraysh men to work with Zayd bin Thabit on the Quran, and that if they were to disagree with Zayd bin Thabit on any point, then they were to write it as the 3 suggested, as it was revealed in their tongue, which seems to indicate again that Uthman was content for there to be differences between Hafsa's manuscript and the manuscripts that were to be distributed. As I mentioned, Umar had already publicly mentioned a missing verse, and in the alternative account, this was also a testing of the waters, to see what type of reaction they would get to such statements. But at that point, no copies had been handed out, and if the reaction had have been too bad, adjustments could have been made. But under Uthman, once the final adjustments had been sorted out, numerous copies were made, and one was sent to every province, and the original manuscripts were sent back to Hafsa. Uthman then ordered all other Quranic materials to be destroyed. In the alternative account, I am imagining that all other Quranic materials were to be destroyed so that there would be no record of the text fragments being different from the text found in the copies that were sent to each province.
Wouldn't Muhammad's widow Hafsa have realized if there were any changes made?
In the imagined alternative account, Hafsa, who was Umar's daughter, would have known. Her first husband would have been amongst the Epicureans, which would be why in the imagined alternative account, Umar was keen to have her married to Abu Bakr or Uthman when her first husband died, as it would be too big of a risk for her to have married one of the non-Epicureans. That Umar wanted Abu Bakr or Uthman to marry Hafsa is reported numerous times in Sahih al-Bukhari. It is explained that the reason they didn't take up the offer was because Muhammad had expressed an interest in marrying her. For your listeners' convenience, I can give them the numbers of a few such reports in Sahih al-Bukhari, in case they wanted to check it up. There's 4005, 5122, and 5145, for example. I'm imagining that perhaps Abu Bakr's daughter Aisha, who was also married to Muhammad, would have been amongst the Epicureans when she grew older. Sahih al-Bukhari reports Hafsa and Aisha playing tricks on Muhammad. Sahih al-Bukhari, 5211 reports how one time they swapped camels to trick Muhammad, while Sahih al-Bukhari 5267 and 6691 report them telling Muhammad that he had got bad breath after he had been drinking honey with another one of his wives. Though Sahih al-Bukhari 5268 reports it was Hafsa that was the wife that gave him honey, not Zainab. And there are even reports in Sahih al-Bukhari in which, as I understand it, Muhammad himself indirectly seemed to suggest that both Hafsa and Aisha were unbelievers. For example, in Sahih al-Bukhari 679 and Sahih al-Bukhari 713, where he called them both companions of Joseph, which I've read refers to Quran 12 verses 39 to 40. While the Pickthall translation has Joseph referring to his cellmates as fellow prisoners, other translations use the word companions, and in verse 40 Joseph makes it clear he considers them to be polytheists. And if Hafsa and Aisha truly believed Muhammad was a prophet, in what way would they be like the companions of Joseph in those verses?
But what about Hafsa's copy of the manuscript? Does that still exist?
As I understand it, after Uthman returned the compilation of the Quran to Hafsa, he ordered that all Quranic materials other than the copies made by Zayd and his helpers to be destroyed, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies. And since, as far as I am aware, there was no other whole copy other than Hafsa's, it would seem that Hafsa's was burnt along with the fragments. But as I understand it, in a commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari, 4987 in Fath al-Bari, it is suggested that the manuscript wasn't destroyed under Uthman, and instead survived until Hafsa had died. That when she died, the governor of Medina sent for the manuscript, and when he got it, he ripped it up, apparently saying that he did it because he feared that after the passing of time, some doubter might foster doubt with regard to those folios. I haven't actually read it myself and am just going off what I read on websites, so if your listeners feel it is important, they might want to check it out themselves.
Okay, so in your imagined alternative account, you are imagining the final changes to have been made under Uthman.
Yes, and just as a side issue, it is reported that after Uthman had sent the Qurans out and ordered the original Quranic materials to be destroyed, there was discontent, despite the administration leading to economic prosperity, and Islamic groups from both Iraq and Egypt laid siege to Uthman's residence and killed him. How any human design was imagined to be done isn't really important. I am just pointing out that it does seem from the Hadith, the Islamic reports on the situation, that there was room for human design to have come into play, because the Hadith seem to indicate that no one seemed to know totally what was said, and that several of the verses were with only one person, and that verses such as the stoning for adultery seemingly went missing, and that other verses reported as once being in the same chapter ended up being in different chapters. That orders were sent out that all the original writings of what was said were to be destroyed, and that copy that had been passed down to Hafsa also being destroyed. Just to be clear, I'm not claiming that there was human design, but it does seem to me that the Hadith seem to leave open the possibility of adjustments having been made after Muhammad died. My problem is that I am not aware of anything in the Quran that seems to me to be beyond human design. And it isn't like I could say to God that I couldn't even imagine how human design could have influenced it. And then there are the problems I mentioned earlier about justifying to God believing certain parts of it. And those two combined means I don't know how to justify to God believing that a belief in it wouldn't also imply the lottery issue. And I don't know how to justify to God believing it would be like a lottery.
Well, that seems like an appropriate place to stop. Thank you for coming in to explain your situation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners. I hope you enjoyed the discussion and will join us again for more afternoon chats.